Welcome to my channel, The Binge Eating Therapist. I'm Sarah, former binge eater turned psychotherapist, and my mission is to use this space to bring content to you that will help you understand your struggle with food and break free from binge eating. And today's subject is a subject that is so dear to my heart because it was a big part of my journey, which was understanding the role of hormones in binge eating. And I have had several attempts at recording this video for you. It's been quite a painful process, but I got there in the end, and I think I was trying to overcomplicate it, and really I had to think about what's useful to know for you and what to do with this information. It's all very well knowing this hormone does this and that hormone does that, but really thinking like, what does it mean for you on the practical level when it comes to recovery from binge eating? And because my attempts at doing this were many, I've compiled a little reel at the end of outtakes because it amused me when I was watching this back. So I put some outtakes at the end of me trying to record this video for you. So let's begin. From my own experience of binge eating, I personally think that hormones have a massive role to play in binge eating and binge eating urges. And so it's really helpful to have some understanding about what might be going on for you. And although these hormones are very powerful and it seems like the body's doing its own thing, the reason why I think it's so helpful to understand what might be going on hormonally or be able to recognize when something is hormonal is it gives us the option of whether to believe our thoughts or not. Because our hormones and how we feel have such an influence over our beliefs. And in those moments when we believe we have no power and it's completely inevitable that we're going to binge, that's what our feelings are telling us. And I think a big piece of recovery is learning how to not believe those feelings and not believe those thoughts. So this is not a way of trying to override healthy hormone functions. We all have an appetite, and if you have a healthy appetite, trying to override it is going to get you in trouble. And I think it's one of the reasons why so many people, almost without exception, unless it really goes back to childhood, young in childhood, for most people, like binge eating really became a problem after dieting, because weight loss changes our hormones, it shifts the levels around. And hormones, it's such a vast subject, it's quite difficult to do it justice in a short YouTube video. But hormones have a massive influence over our appetite and our drive to eat. They've identified over 200 hormones that we have, and we only tend to hear about a dozen of them. They're the ones we know the most about. There are other ones that we don't know much about at all. But of the main ones, so think of the main ones as like your thyroid hormones, so estrogen, testosterone, cortisol, growth hormone, all these ones that we know a lot more about. If you put any of those into Google and put like, does it affect appetite? The answer is yes. When one of these is knocked out, it has this sort of cascading effect. So maybe all of them, like on their own, affect appetite, but it's probably a lot to do with how they interact with each other. We know that hormones can compete with each other, so it means when one goes up, another goes down. So we know that that happens with estrogen and the thyroid hormones. So if you take too much thyroid medication and you're female, your estrogen levels are going to drop. And the question that comes up again for a lot of women is like, why is my eating so out of control when I have PMS? Well, we know that lower estrogen levels increases appetite. But again, we don't know how much of that is the estrogen itself or whether the estrogen is then impacting another hormone somewhere else. So this stuff to me is, well, it's fascinating. And on one hand, it's frustrating because we don't know what we don't know, but what we do know, we can try and use to our advantage. So I spent years trying to understand for me where the physical ended and where I began, if you like, in this sense of like, what do I have control over and what, like to some degree, we're at the mercy of our hormones. And if we think about, I'll probably just focus on one today, if we think about ghrelin, the hunger hormone, a lot of people have heard that word, and you may know quite a lot about ghrelin, you might not know a lot about ghrelin. But if you don't eat or you are trying to restrict, your ghrelin levels increase. Now, hormones can affect our brains, they can affect our motivation, and they can affect our thoughts. And ghrelin's job is to make you think about food. And this is why it's not possible to restrict your food to any significant degree without becoming obsessed with food, because that's what ghrelin is going to make you do. And we know that it's not just physical hunger that increases ghrelin. We know that just anticipating restriction has a hormonal effect. So that's another fascinating thing about hormones, is the way that you are thinking about something and the emotions that you are having can change and affect your body chemistry. You know, think about it in terms of sexual desire. The hormonal changes are extraordinary and they can happen really quickly. And so it's the same around food, like where we put our focus and our attention can have a big influence on what's going on with our hormones. There is a lot of it that is outside of our control though, because the system is so complicated and because our bodies and our brains kind of get on with it for us to some degree. We can have some influence, but we know that hormones can be conditioned by eating habits. So if you are used to eating at a certain time, if you always ate at 3 o'clock, for example, that was when you had a meal most days, you would find that at 3 o'clock, before you had your food, even if you weren't thinking about it, your ghrelin levels would start to rise. So we get in these conditioned patterns with our hormones, and that's where we can make some changes. So when you first try to change any eating behaviours, what you'll find is like your hormones are on the old pattern. So when you are used to eating something at a certain time, or you're used to eating something when you are triggered by a certain event, that's why change can feel so hard, because it takes the hormones a while to catch up, but our bodies do adapt. And so another thing that impacts ghrelin is the time of day. For everybody, our ghrelin levels get higher throughout the day. And they think that this might be like an evolutionary advantage. Thousands of years ago, we wouldn't have been able to have woken up first thing in the morning and go to the fridge or go to the cupboard and have breakfast there immediately for us. We'd have to go out and find it. So it's probably a reason why ghrelin is lower in the mornings, because our ancestors would have had to have got up and sorted out some food. It wasn't there straight away. So it makes sense to eat more before you go to bed and fill yourself up with food at that time, so that in the morning you have the energy to go and seek food out. Stress impacts ghrelin. So a stressful event can send your ghrelin higher. And the fascinating thing about that as well is, like, if the stress happens later in the day, it sends your ghrelin even higher. So we seem to become less resilient when it comes to stressful things later on in the day. Most people who struggle with binge eating, it's happening towards the end of the day. And that could be hormonal, not just ghrelin. There's other hormones that are in play in our circadian systems, which is like our day to night systems, that are going to affect our hunger. It's worth a quick mention of insulin. Insulin has a satiating effect. So when you eat and your insulin levels rise, that increases your sense of satisfaction. So it's one of the reasons why if you are eating when you're not hungry, it's harder to feel satisfied, because you don't get the same rise, because your insulin levels are probably starting at a higher point. And then there's leptin, which is the hormone that tells us that we're full and we've eaten enough. And again, that I mentioned earlier about hormones interacting with each other, leptin and insulin interact with one another as well. So you could find that if your insulin is high, if you're insulin resistant, that extra insulin that's floating around in your blood is blocking the leptin receptors. So when scientists discovered leptin, they thought, well, this is brilliant, because it must be that people don't have enough leptin, and that's why they struggle with compulsive eating. So they started giving people more leptin, but actually they reckon there's about 100 people in the world who are leptin deficient. So it's unlikely that you're one of them. But what we do think is there's a lot of people that are leptin resistant. So it's not that the leptin's not there in your body, it's that the part of your brain that has the receptors and picks up the fact and sends the message to you that there is plenty of food is not working. And insulin, high levels of insulin, can make your brain blind to the leptin. So it's another reason why when it comes to these binge foods that tend to be more processed foods, they send our insulin levels up, and we find that we can eat more and more of them because that message from leptin is not getting through. We're not feeling satisfied. We can just keep going and going. But for me, the important takeaway points from just this very tiny, tiny slither of what we know about hormones that I've shared with you today is that, one, how you think does have an influence over your body chemistry, so that can make a difference. That would be the first thing to think about. I suppose the second thing is that this is such, biology is powerful. Biology is really powerful. And if you get in a fight with your biology, you will lose. So I suppose I urge you to try and make friends with your biology. And I think this is the part where control comes into it. There's so much about our bodies that we can't control. And when we want to lose weight or change the shape of our body, we're trying to take control over something that for many of us would mean getting into a fight with our biology. I think it's easy to fall into the trap after seeing a video like this, thinking, I must change all my eating habits, and that over-focusing on the behaviour as a way to try and fix whatever's going on hormonally. But I think that with anything, and more so than ever I think with food, I think that health and well-being starts in the mind. You know, there was a fascinating case of a woman with a multiple personality disorder, as they used to call it then. It's now called dissociative identity disorder, I think. Case of a woman in Seattle who, in one of her personalities, she was diabetic, and when the other personality was active, there was no trace of diabetes. So that just, for me, like highlights how extraordinarily powerful the mind is when it comes to the mind-body connection. And when mind and body are at war with each other, we're really setting ourselves up for some quite serious physical dysregulation, which is then going to have a massive influence on our motivations and our behaviours. So, as always, in my mind, the goal is peace. But on that note, I'm going to say goodbye, and I'll see you on the next video. Your adrenal glands, it's your ovaries. If you're female, it's your testes if you're male. I'm sure there's some other glands that I've missed off, but yeah, glands. Shut up. So, I don't like this. I didn't like it because I felt like it was turning into a lesson on hormones that are actually which is controlled by the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus in the brain, and it influences and is also can be in a little stalk that connects the two called the pituitary hypothalamic axis. Hypothalamic axis, I think. In 2009, they found, who's they? I think first of all, it's important to highlight just how the subject of hormones and how hormones affect appetite is such a vast subject that I'm not sure how I'm going to be able to do it justice. But I thought, because it's so complicated, I thought I might just tell you a bit about my experience of, to not be working properly either.